History Secrets.
We are living through a moment of enormous tension in the international system, and some analyses suggest that we are entering a period that dangerously resembles the moments that preceded the Great World Wars. But why? What exactly is changing in the world? One possible interpretation starts from the observation that the international order built after the Cold War is dissolving. For decades, the United States saw itself as the main guarantor of an international order based on rules. In this system, multilateral institutions and military alliances would function as mechanisms of global coordination. The United States would act as a kind of referee, or some critics say, as the police of that order. But, according to some recent analyses, this vision is changing rapidly. Strategic documents published by the American government itself indicate a clear transition. The priority would no longer be to preserve a universal international order. The priority would be to defend direct national interests. This shift seems particularly evident in the way Washington has returned to emphasize a historical concept, the Monroe Doctrine, a doctrine formulated back in the 19th century. The central idea of the Monroe Doctrine was simple. The Western Hemisphere should remain under the strategic influence of the United States. External powers should not expand their political or military presence in the region. For a long time, this doctrine seemed to have lost relevance in a globalized world, but some interpretations suggest that it is returning to the center of American strategy, especially in the face of China's growing presence in South America. In recent years, Beijing has significantly expanded its investments in the region. Infrastructure projects, trade agreements, financing for major developments. For many South American countries, these investments represent development opportunities. Roads, ports, railways, energy projects. But, from a geopolitical perspective, some American strategists view this expansion with great concern. Economic presence could, in the future, turn into political and strategic influence, and that, according to this view, would represent a threat to the historical primacy of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. It is within this context that some observers interpret the growing tension involving Venezuela. In recent years, the Caribbean region has seen an increased American naval presence, movements that some analysts see as part of an attempt to reaffirm strategic control over the region. This situation creates a delicate geopolitical dilemma, because pressure on countries in the region can generate chain reactions. South American governments tend to be extremely sensitive to any sign of external intervention, especially due to the history of political interventions during the 20th century. Thus, a seemingly localized conflict could generate much broader consequences, and this possibility of a chain reaction is precisely what worries some analysts. At the same time, another major source of tension continues in Eastern Europe. The war between Russia and Ukraine has become one of the most important conflicts of our time, and also a central point of rivalry between powers. Even when specific battles enter phases of lower intensity, the conflict remains embedded in a much larger context, a context of strategic competition between Russia, NATO, and the European Union. Some analysts argue that Europe fears that a peace agreement could allow Russia to consolidate territorial gains, and later reorganize its strategic position in the region. For this reason, according to this interpretation, certain European governments support the continuation of military aid to Ukraine, even in the face of enormous economic and political costs. Meanwhile, a third source of tension remains active in the Middle East, the rivalry between Israel and Iran, a rivalry that manifests itself through indirect conflicts, limited strikes, and disputes for regional influence. This set of simultaneous crises raises a concerning question. Is the international system entering a phase of structural transition? A phase in which the global order built after the Cold War ceases to function? Historically, moments of power transition tend to be dangerous periods. When the distribution of power among major powers changes rapidly, the international system often struggles to adapt. For decades, the world lived under an order largely dominated by a single power. But this configuration now seems to be transforming into something more complex. A multipolar system, with several centers of power competing simultaneously. In this type of scenario, new dilemmas emerge. How to establish rules accepted by all. How to ensure strategic stability. How to prevent regional disputes from turning into global confrontations. These questions still do not have clear answers, and this increases the sense of uncertainty that many observers perceive in the international landscape. Some political narratives attempt to simplify this complex reality, turning geopolitical conflicts into simple moral stories. Good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarianism, civilization versus barbarism. But more strategic analyses suggest that reality is usually far more complicated. Great powers rarely act solely based on ideological principles. They also respond to strategic interests, resources, trade routes, balances of power. And when different powers believe that their security or prosperity is threatened, the risk of conflict increases, even when no one desires a full-scale war. This is a recurring pattern in history. Almost all major wars began as limited conflicts, regional disputes, diplomatic crises, apparently controlled interventions. But gradually, new alliances were activated, new actors became involved, and escalation became increasingly difficult to control. This dynamic raises a troubling question. Is the current world moving toward a similar scenario? Or are there still mechanisms capable of preventing a global escalation? This question remains open, and perhaps it is precisely this uncertainty that defines the historical moment we are living in today. The transformation of the international system does not involve only isolated conflicts. It involves something deeper, a structural change in how power is distributed across the planet. And for much of the post-Cold War period, the international system was dominated by a single power, the United States. Its military, technological, and financial superiority created a relatively stable global structure, but also a deeply asymmetrical one. This period is often described as the unipolar moment in history, a phase in which Washington had the ability to project power into virtually any region of the world and directly influence the main international institutions. However, in the last 2 decades, this structure has begun to change. New centers of power have emerged, especially in Eurasia. China has become one of the largest industrial powers in history. Its economy has become central to global production chains, and its financial presence has expanded to dozens of countries. At the same time, Russia has sought to rebuild its strategic capacity after the collapse of the Soviet Union, strengthening its military forces, reorganizing its foreign policy, and seeking new geopolitical partners. This process has led many analysts to speak of a new configuration of power, a multipolar system, where several powers compete for influence simultaneously. But this transition raises a classic problem of geopolitics: how do established powers react to the rise of new rivals? Historically, this type of moment tends to generate intense tensions. Some interpretations suggest that we are observing something similar today, an increasingly intense strategic competition between blocks of power. On one side, the traditional Atlantic axis, the United States and European allies. On the other side, a growing alignment between powers of the Eurasian continent: Russia, China, Iran, and, in certain contexts, India and other emerging economies. This alignment does not necessarily mean a perfect alliance. These countries have different interests and often compete among themselves, but they share a common concern: to prevent a single power from dominating the international system. In this context, an old geopolitical concept has regained relevance: the so-called heartland theory. Formulated at the beginning of the 20th century by the British geographer Halford Mackinder, this theory suggested that control of the center of Eurasia could determine the global balance of power. According to this view, whoever controlled the heart of the Eurasian continent would have decisive strategic advantage. For decades, British and American strategists interpreted this idea as a warning. No power should dominate the Eurasian continent. Otherwise, that power could combine massive natural resources, large population, and continental infrastructure, creating a force capable of rivaling any maritime power. According to some historical interpretations, this logic influenced several containment strategies throughout the 20th century, first against Germany, then against the Soviet Union, and now, possibly, against China's rise. In this scenario, Eurasia is once again seen as the main strategic chessboard of the planet, a space where different projects of economic integration compete with each other. China promotes its Belt and Road Initiative, a vast infrastructure network connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa. Railways, ports, logistical corridors. Russia, in turn, seeks to strengthen energy routes and trade corridors that cross its territory, linking northern Eurasia to the southern part of the continent. And at the center of these strategic routes emerges a country of enormous geopolitical importance: Iran. Several regional integration projects pass through Iranian territory: trade corridors between Central Asia and the Middle East, routes connecting Russia to the Indian Ocean, projects linking India, Europe, and the Middle East. For this reason, some analysts consider Iran a true geopolitical pivot, a point of intersection between different continental trade systems. If these economic networks consolidate, they could reduce global dependence on traditional maritime routes historically dominated by naval powers. And this raises a profound strategic question. If a continental trade system strengthens in Eurasia, what will be the role of traditional maritime powers? Some analysts argue that this scenario represents one of the greatest geopolitical challenges of the 21st century, because it could completely reshape the global economic structure. And when major structural transformations occur in the international system, the risk of conflict increases. Not necessarily because anyone wants war, but because different powers perceive existential threats. It is at this point that many observers begin to speak about a possible historical cycle, moments when international systems enter crisis, and new global orders need to emerge. Throughout history, these transitions rarely occurred peacefully. They were often accompanied by major conflicts, wars that redefined borders, reorganized alliances, and created new international rules. But that does not mean a global conflict is inevitable. History is not a predetermined destiny. Societies learn, institutions evolve, and political leaders can choose different paths. Even so, the signs of growing tension in several regions of the planet lead many analysts to observe the present with concern. Because when multiple crises accumulate simultaneously, the international system becomes more fragile. Small events can trigger major reactions, and complex alliances can turn local conflicts into much larger disputes. This is the logic that many historians identify when studying the beginning of past great wars. Seemingly isolated events. That triggered process is difficult to contain. The big question that remains is simple. Will the world be able to go through this transition without repeating the mistakes of history? Or are we just at the beginning of a new phase of confrontation between great powers? The answer is still being written, by present events, and by the decisions that leaders and societies will make in the coming years. When we analyze the history of great powers, one pattern appears repeatedly. Moments of major transformation rarely occur without tension, and many times these tensions arise precisely when an international order begins to lose stability. For decades, the international system functioned under a relatively clear set of rules. Even with regional conflicts, there was a relatively predictable global structure. Multilateral institutions, economic agreements, military balances. But when new powers emerge, that balance begins to change, and the rules that once seemed natural begin to be challenged. Some analysts argue that we are exactly in this kind of historical moment, a phase in which different centers of power begin to redefine their positions, and to seek greater autonomy within the international system. This becomes especially visible when we observe the growth of alternative economic blocs. Among them, one of the most discussed today is the group known as BRICS. Initially formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group has begun to attract increasing interest from other countries, especially from emerging economies. For many of these countries, BRICS represents an attempt to rebalance the global financial structure, creating alternative institutions, its own financing systems, and new mechanisms of economic cooperation. This trend also appears in discussions about international trade. Various countries have been seeking to reduce dependence on a single dominant currency in global transactions, a change that, if it advances significantly, could profoundly alter the functioning of the international financial system. This happens because the currency used in global trade has enormous strategic impact. It allows countries to finance deficits, influence capital flows, and project economic power far beyond their own borders. When countries begin to explore alternatives to this system, they are not just making financial choices, they are also redesigning the global balance of power. This transformation is taking place at the same time that regional conflicts remain active in various parts of the planet, and these conflicts often connect with larger disputes between great powers. In the Middle East, for example, historical rivalries continue to generate instability. The relationship between Israel and Iran remains one of the most delicate in the international system. Indirect conflicts, disputes for influence, limited military operations. All of this creates an environment where small escalations can quickly generate larger crises. At the same time, new regional alliances are being formed, and large-scale economic projects are beginning to cross historically unstable regions. When strategic trade routes pass through conflict areas, geopolitical risk intensifies, because different powers begin to see these territories as critical security points. This leads us to another important historical pattern, the idea that wars often begin as limited operations, but end up expanding in unexpected ways. Governments often believe that they can control escalation, that a conflict will be brief, or that it will remain restricted to a certain territory. But history shows that reality rarely follows that script. Alliances are activated, political reactions emerge, internal pressures increase. And what began as a localized crisis can quickly involve multiple countries. It was exactly this kind of dynamic that marked the beginning of the First World War. At the time, many leaders believed the conflict would be short. A quick war. Limited. But a sequence of military alliances transformed the initial crisis into a continental confrontation, and then into a global war. Today, some analysts fear that the international system may once again be accumulating similar points of tension: regional conflicts, economic disputes, structural changes in the balance of power. None of these factors in isolation necessarily leads to a world war. But when several of them happen at the same time, the international system becomes more unstable. This instability creates an environment in which miscalculations become more dangerous. Decisions made in moments of crisis can generate consequences far greater than expected. And that is exactly why so many analysts are watching the global landscape with growing attention. Because we are living through a moment of profound transformation. The international order created after the end of the Cold War seems to be entering a phase of transition. A phase in which new rules have not yet been fully defined. And while those rules are not consolidated, the world passes through a period of uncertainty. A period in which different power projects compete simultaneously. In this kind of historical moment, the future remains open. Some transitions result in new forms of cooperation. Others end up leading to prolonged confrontations. The big question is which of these paths the world will choose, and whether current leaders will be capable of navigating this transition without repeating the tragedies of the past. Because history demonstrates one thing clearly. Major global transformations always test the ability of societies to avoid the escalation of conflict. And it is exactly this test that seems to be before us now. But there is one specific point in this global transformation that is beginning to attract more and more attention. South America, a region that for a long time remained relatively distant from the great conflicts between powers, but that is now beginning to acquire growing strategic weight. This is happening for several reasons: natural resources, trade routes, and also the region's geopolitical position within the Western Hemisphere. Among all the countries in the region, Brazil occupies a particularly important role. Its territorial size, its economic weight, and its agricultural and energy capacity. All of this makes the country a central actor in the regional balance. At the same time, trade relations between Brazil and China have grown extraordinarily over the last decades. China has become Brazil's main trading partner, buying large volumes of agricultural commodities, minerals, and other strategic products. This partnership has profoundly transformed Brazilian international trade, especially in the agricultural sector. For a long time, the United States was a major supplier of soybeans to the Chinese market, but trade tensions between Washington and Beijing opened space for new suppliers. In this context, Brazil came to play a fundamental role. Chinese demand for food grew rapidly, and Brazilian agribusiness responded by expanding its production and exports. This transformation strengthened the economic relationship between the two countries, but it also brought important geopolitical implications. When major trade flows become consolidated between countries, they create networks of economic interest, and these networks often end up influencing political and strategic decisions. For some analysts, this means that South America has become a relevant piece in the global dispute between great powers, especially between the United States and China. China seeks to guarantee access to natural resources and markets. The United States seeks to preserve its historical influence in the Western Hemisphere. This scenario creates a delicate environment for the countries of the region, because they need to balance economic interests and strategic pressures. One of the possible sources of tension mentioned by some analysts involves Venezuela. The country has some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Historically, Venezuela also occupies a sensitive geographic position in the Caribbean, a region close to American territory and important for maritime routes. For this reason, political changes or conflicts involving Venezuela often attract international attention and can generate reactions from different regional actors. Some hypothetical scenarios discussed in geopolitical analyses consider the possibility of escalations involving this country, limited interventions, diplomatic pressure, or indirect conflicts. If a crisis of this type were to deepen, other countries in the region could find themselves involved, whether through political alliances or through concerns about regional stability. In this context, Brazil could face a strategic dilemma: remain neutral, act as a mediator, or align itself with certain blocks of power. This would not be a simple decision, because each choice would have economic, diplomatic, and security implications. In addition, any regional crisis would take place at a time of great global tension, with rivalries between powers already present in several parts of the planet. This combination of factors makes the current international landscape particularly complex, because multiple systems of dispute are unfolding at the same time: regional conflicts, economic rivalries, structural changes in the global order. None of these factors in isolation determines the future, but together, they create an environment of great strategic uncertainty. And when the international system enters this kind of phase, different paths become possible. Some lead to cooperation, others lead to the escalation of rivalries. That is why many analysts consider that we are living through a decisive moment in contemporary history, a moment in which the global architecture of power is being redefined. The outcome of this transformation has not yet been determined, but its consequences may shape the international system for the coming decades. Perhaps that is the main question that emerges from all of this analysis. Will the world be able to reorganize its international order peacefully? Or are we only at the beginning of a new era of disputes between great powers? The answer, as so many times in history, will depend on the choices made in the present era. Because when we analyze the history of great powers, one pattern becomes clear. Moments of profound transformation rarely occur without tension. And very often, these tensions emerge precisely when an international order begins to lose its stability. For decades, the international system operated under a relatively clear set of rules. Even with regional conflicts, there was a structure that provided a certain level of predictability: multilateral institutions, economic agreements, military balances. But when new powers begin to rise, that balance starts to shift, and the rules that once seemed natural begin to be questioned. Some analysts argue that we are now entering exactly this kind of historical phase, a moment when different centers of power are redefining their positions and seeking greater autonomy within the international system. This becomes especially evident when we observe the strengthening of alternative economic blocs. One of the most discussed today is the group known as BRICS. Originally formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group has increasingly attracted interest from other nations, particularly from emerging economies. For many of these countries, BRICS represents an attempt to rebalance the global financial system by creating alternative institutions, independent financing mechanisms, and new forms of economic cooperation. This trend is also visible in discussions about international trade. Several countries are seeking to reduce their dependence on a single dominant currency in global transactions, a shift that, if it advances significantly, could transform the international financial system. This is because the currency used in global trade carries enormous strategic weight. It allows nations to finance deficits, influence capital flows, and project economic power far beyond their own borders. When countries begin exploring alternatives to this system, they are not simply making financial decisions. They are actively reshaping the global balance of power. At the same time, regional conflicts continue across different parts of the world, and these conflicts are often connected to broader rivalries between major powers. In the Middle East, for instance, long-standing rivalries continue to fuel instability. The relationship between Israel and Iran remains one of the most fragile in the international system. Indirect conflicts, power struggles, limited military actions, all contribute to an environment where small escalations can quickly spiral into larger crises. Meanwhile, new regional alliances are taking shape, and large-scale economic projects are crossing areas that have historically been unstable. When strategic trade routes pass through regions of conflict, geopolitical risks increase significantly, because these territories become critical points of security interest for multiple powers. This leads us to another recurring historical pattern. Wars often begin as limited operations, but expand far beyond initial expectations. Governments frequently believe they can control escalation, that conflicts will remain contained, or that they will be short-lived. But history consistently shows otherwise. Alliances are activated, political pressures rise, internal dynamics intensify. And what starts as a localized crisis can quickly draw in multiple nations. This was exactly the dynamic that led to the outbreak of the First World War. At the time, many leaders believed the war would be brief, a limited conflict, quick and controlled. Instead, a chain of alliances transformed the crisis into a continental war, and ultimately into a global conflict. Today, some analysts fear that the international system may once again be accumulating similar pressures. Regional conflicts, economic tensions, structural shifts in the balance of power. Individually, none of these factors necessarily leads to global war, but when they occur simultaneously, they create a far more unstable system. This instability increases the risk of miscalculation. Decisions made under pressure can trigger consequences far beyond what was intended. And that is precisely why many analysts are observing the global situation with increasing concern, because we are living through a period of deep transformation. The international order established after the Cold War appears to be entering a transitional phase, a phase in which new rules have yet to be fully defined. And while these rules remain uncertain, the world moves through a period of instability, a time when multiple visions of power compete simultaneously. In moments like this, the future remains open. Some transitions lead to cooperation, others result in prolonged confrontation. The central question is which path will be chosen, and whether today's leadership will be capable of navigating this transition without repeating past mistakes. Because history makes one thing clear: major global transformations always test the ability of societies to prevent escalation. And that is exactly the test we seem to be facing now. Throughout this documentary, we explored evidence, accounts, and discoveries that attempt to explain this historical event. But one question remains unanswered. If everything happened exactly as we believe, then why are there so many contradictory records? Why do certain details seem to have disappeared from official history? Perhaps because this mystery has not yet been fully resolved, and perhaps there are still clues waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.